So there are three main theories of international relations. There are other theories, but they're not kind of mainstream. They are more like a radical or critical theories, like Marxism is a theory of international relations. But it's not a mainstream theory. It's not used by the majority of scholars in the world. The majority of the scholars of international relations fall into one of these three categories: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And today, let me speak about each of them in some detail. But first, we have to have a definition of what is international relations theory. What do we mean by theory in international relations? And there are many ways of defining it, but a basic way, a simple way to look at it would be to say that IR theory is a coherent, precise, and orderly body of knowledge that not only describes how actors behave the way they do, but also why they behave in a certain way. Theory explains regularities of behavior and cause and effect relationships in international relations that leads one to expect outcomes if certain conditions are present. Now, I know this is a long definition, but it contains all the key elements of international relations theory. And I should clarify that this definition is not from anybody. It's based on a definition or the writings of Kenneth Walsh, who is a very big name theorist of international relations who passed away earlier this year. But I have modified it. And I have made it more kind of a general. Professor Walsh was a realist, but he was also a big theorist of international relations whose work is relevant for all of us. But I have slightly modified this and made this into this particular definition. But there are three key elements to this. First, theory has to be a coherent, precise, and orderly body of knowledge. It has to be systematic. It's a systematic presentation of the facts of international relations and the knowledge of international relations. It cannot be chaotic, cannot be haphazard, it cannot be messy. It has to be very clear, systematic, and precise. And this is why we divide them into three theories, or if you want, four theories. We label them, we classify them, we list assumptions under each theory, which I will be explaining shortly. The second element of this definition is that theory explains not only how, but why. It's not how countries behave, but why they behave. It's the explanation that is very key. And that is about the cause and effect relationship. Why certain causes lead to certain outcomes. And in that sense, theory also explains irregularities of behavior. Why certain states behave in the same way over and over a long period of time. Why does the United States behave like a great power? It was doing that in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. Can we think of China behaving the same way as it behaved in the 17th century? These regularities, when they occur, that's what theory tries to explain. Why countries behave in a certain way. Why all states seek self-interest. Why war becomes such a recurring phenomenon in international politics. Why there is always war. There was a war in 2000 years ago in the 1st century AD or 1st century BC. There was a war in the medieval period. There was war in the 17th century. There's war in the 19th century. There's war in the 20th century. So why war is recurring through history? That's a regularity in international politics. So theory tries to explain that. And the third element is the expectation. That is kind of a predictive. That if certain conditions are present, you expect things to happen in a particular way. By understanding theory, you know how things might happen in the future if some conditions are present, if the same conditions are present. This is not to make a prediction. Nobody can predict, really. Nobody who knows international relations in a responsible way, would make a prediction that there will be no war or there will be no peace. That's foolish, because international relations scholars are always wrong, and mostly have been wrong about making predictions. But you can make an expectation. You can make a sort of a, what do you call it, intelligent guess that if certain conditions are present, some things will happen. For example, if China tries to rise and China becomes rich and powerful in an increasing way, as it has been for the last 30 years, if China continues to grow in the way it has grown for the last 30 years, for the next 30 years, then one theory would predict, particularly realism, that there will be war between China and the United States. It won't say there will definitely be war between the United States and China, but if a country is growing rapidly and that country is not an established power, but an unhappy power. China has been kind of relatively unhappy, dissatisfied for some time about its position in the international system. It did not like to be exploited, dominated by the West in the 19th century and 20th century, and later on by the United States. It did not like to be number two to the United States. If China continues to grow for another 30 years, it will challenge American position, and that will lead to war. That's the realist view. And you can make a prediction that if China continues to grow for the next 30 years, there will be war. But you cannot say there will be war. The condition is if China continues to grow at a rapid rate, like 10% economic growth, then there will be war. So theory can make a little bit of those predictions if you know it well and use it carefully. But mostly, it's not about prediction. It's more about description and explanation. It's about how the world works and why the world works the way it does. So let me then move to the three theories: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. One way to look at these theories is to see them as three lenses, three colored lenses, for example. So let's say dark red and blue. So if you wear a pair of glasses with dark lenses, the world looks like in a certain way to you. If you change your lenses and wear red lenses, the environment will look different to you. Your mind is the same, your eyesight is the same, but because you're wearing a different lens, the neighborhood, the outside world looks very different to you. And same if you wear a blue lens, again, your perception of the world, your image of the world changes. And theories are a little bit like that. They're like three colored lenses. And depending on which lens you're wearing, or who is wearing what lens, the world may look different. The same world out there, same mind, but the world looks a bit different to you. And it could be quite different from each other. The world that looks dark and black is not the same as the world that looks red, which can be positive and cheerful in some cultures. Like the Chinese like red rather than dark. And if you wear blue, which is a sign of peace and friendliness, the world may look very differently. You know, the United Nations, blue is the color of the United Nations. UN peacekeepers usually wear blue helmets. So dark, you can say dark is realism, and red is liberalism, and blue is constructivism. But no matter what you do, theory can be likened to these three lenses. And another thing about theory is that theory is an assumption that everybody has, whether you know it or don't know it, whether you're a leader, whether you're an analyst, whether you're a student. Everybody has in the back of the mind some assumption, some idea, some belief, some feeling about how the world works. You may not call it theory, but you have it in your mind. So some people are born optimists. Some people are very positive. They always think everybody else is nice, the world is good, life is good. You are generally very optimistic. Or some people are more pessimistic. They always feel pessimistic, negative, or suspicious, or fearful, even if they're very rich. Doesn't matter how rich and powerful you are, you can be very suspicious. Like President Nixon, American president, who had to resign office because of a scandal, Watergate scandal. His basic attitude was always very suspicious, negative. Even when he was re-elected as president, he still felt very sad and depressed, according to his biography. Whereas if you look at President Clinton, who was president much later, more recently in the 1990s, very cheerful person. Even if he had a lot of difficulty and he was impeached by the US Congress, but he was still positive, still cheerful, still nice to people. He was also in a scandal, different kind of scandal, but he never lost his cheerfulness. And he's still one of the most popular American presidents, much more popular than President Nixon. And then you can have somebody like President Obama, who is not very sure, very serious. He's neither happy nor unhappy. He's very serious. He's like a professor. Always likes to, when he gives a speech, you can see he is so serious. Some people find it difficult to understand him because he's always keeping a very serious. He makes some jokes, but I'm pretty sure his jokes are written by some people, his speechwriter. And I don't think he would know how to make a joke on his own. So, 3 different personalities, same American president, but different mindsets. And among you also, you will have the same kind of attitude. Some of you will be happy and cheerful and optimistic, hopeful. Some of you will be negative, kind of suspicious or kind of pessimistic. And some of you will be in between. You can find examples in Asia. Singapore's leader, Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore is a very rich country, very prosperous country, very stable country. But Mr. Lee has always been very pessimistic, to say it mildly. He doesn't see the world from the blue lens or from the red lens. He sees it from the dark lens. He's very suspicious and very pessimistic. He doesn't think the future is going to be good or peaceful. At best, we can manage, but he doesn't see peace breaking out. So, whereas people like India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was very cheerful and optimistic for a long time, until his last days. He always saw the world in positive, idealistic, moral terms. And he was always hopeful that there could be peace and friendship among nations. So, this is present in all of you, and this is what theory actually does. Whether you know it, or the leaders know it, but they have this kind of different sort of hardwired perceptions about the world in their brain. And it is the job of the theorist, job of the scholar, people like myself, people like what you would turn out to be in the future. It is our job to tease it out, to make what is implicit in the minds of leaders and people more explicit. And this is where theory helps. Theory is like the key to understanding what's in the minds of leaders, what's in the minds of states, or what's in the minds of people. And as I said, theory has four main functions. One is to understand how the world works. One is to explain why the world works the way it does. Third, a little bit less important, but everybody tries to do that, predict. And fourth, prescribe. So, understand, explain, predict, and prescribe. Now, the prescription side is a little different from the others. Prescription is like once you know what's out there, once you know how to explain what's out there, once you know how to make some kind of a supposition, some kind of a projection, some kind of a sort of informal prediction, or maybe some kind of a anticipation. You don't predict, but you anticipate the future. Once you've done that, you then tell others what they should do. Or you should tell yourself what I should do. So you prescribe. You become more normative. It's not what the world is, but what the world ought to be. So a lot of international relations scholars have to do prescription. It's called policy advice. Now, especially if you study in a university in Washington, D.C., like my university, we are professional schools of international relations. A lot of our teaching and also a lot of our research is about, must end up with a policy prescription. It not only just say what is America's policy towards Asia is, or why it is the way it is, but what America should do to Asia, or what China should do to Asia, or Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, or what America should do to China, or China should do to America. So America should not acquire military bases in Southeast Asia. America should give more aid to Southeast Asian countries, or ASEAN countries. America should be careful about not containing China. These prescriptions come out of your understanding, your analysis, or your explanation, and your anticipation, your projections about what might happen in the future. So these four functions of theory are very closely linked. And this is what every international relations scholar, student, professor, practitioner, no matter what you are, each of you have to do. As you study international relations at higher levels, you will find that every textbook, every piece of writing are full of each of these four elements. All these four functions of theory are present in the literature on international relations to different degrees. Some people tend to put more emphasis into describing and explaining. Some people put more emphasis into prescribing and also predicting. If you work for a university, you're more likely to do understanding and explaining. If you're working for a think tank, like the Brookings Institution or Rand Corporation, or these are like think tanks that help advise governments what they should do. They do policy and relevant research. If you work for a think tank, then you are going to do more prediction and prescription. And in some universities like mine, we are a professional school. We're based in Washington, D.C. Our job is to do a bit of both. So our courses are designed partly with a very practical side to it. Because a lot of our students go to work for the U.S. government, like the State Department or Defense Department, or even the White House. And a lot of them work in the think tanks or the international development organizations and NGOs and the United Nations. So we have to tell them how they should also think about predicting and prescribing. Okay, now in my next section of my lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about realism and liberalism first. And I'm going to be very brief because there is a lot more to it than I can cover in one lecture today. And if you want, I can leave my PowerPoints to you with the department, and you can consult them. So this is a short summary of realism and liberalism. I have a lot more on this, but each of these two theories have 5 points. Again, I'm trying to simplify things here. The first one is about actors. Who are the main actors? Who actually play the game of international relations? Most important player of international relations. Who is that? Now, for realism, the main actors are states. States here means governments, states with territory and sovereignty. And they're not the only actors, but they're the main actors. That basically leaves out other kinds of actors, like an international organization, like the UN, or an NGO, or a multinational company. These are not important actors. Only the states that matter in international relations. So international relations is about what states do to each other. It's about diplomacy. It's not about international institutions like UN or ASEAN, their role. It's not about multinational companies, even if they play a role. But realists don't believe none of these can rise above the state. None of them can challenge the authority of the state. That's a very traditional view of international relations, but that's realism. And point 2 of realism is that the structure of the international system is anarchic, or they call it anarchy. Anarchy is the basic feature of international relations. Now, what does anarchy mean here? Anarchy does not mean chaos. It doesn't mean violence. In a dictionary sense, anarchy means there is no law and order. There is chaos. There is violence. In international relations, anarchy doesn't mean that per se. It simply means there is no higher authority above the state. So it relates to the earlier point, that the states are the most important actors in international relations. Now, when you say there is no higher authority above the state, that means there is no world state. There is no super state. There is no God. There is no church. There is no Shanghai. Nothing overrides the state. It's a very secular conception of international relations, and it comes out of the European experience. Before the 17th century, before there is a treaty called Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, Europe's states were not sovereign in the sense that they always had to obey the Catholic Church or the papacy, the Pope. The Pope was a higher authority above the state. The Pope had its own army, and the Pope can interfere in the internal affairs of all the big states, no matter how big they are, how big powers they are. The Church was higher than the state. And there was a kind of an idea of a Holy Roman Empire, a successor to the Roman Empire, which had crumbled 1,000 years ago, and more than 1,000 years ago. And there was an idea that Europe was all aspiring to become like the Roman Empire again. These nation states of Europe were not really the ultimate form of statehood. There has to be an empire which is above those states. So either it was an empire like the reconstituted Roman Empire, or the Pope. That was above the state. Now today nobody will think like that. Especially since the 17th century, we have had empires, but empires are always considered temporary aberrations. Even if when they're permanent, they behave like a single state. They do not command allegiance over states that are not part of the empire. What it basically means that today we do not have anything above our nation state. The United Nations, even if you are a member of the United Nations, is not a super state. It cannot tell you what to do. It cannot make a law for you except where you have agreed to let the United Nations make some rules for you. But those rules are complied with voluntarily. Unless there is an extreme case where you commit an attack or aggression, the United Nations retaliates in the name of collective security. But for realists, there is nothing like a super state. Nothing like the United Nations is not a super state. There's no higher authority. Of course, most countries today do not believe that there is any religious divine authority above the state. Maybe some of the Islamic countries think that there is a higher authority above the state, but they say that in theory, but in practice, they also behave like nation states, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, even though they are theocratic states, Islamic states. But when they go to the United Nations, when they deal with other countries, they behave just like states. There's no higher authority over the state. So that is basically the second point, that anarchy means no higher authority above the state today. And the third thing the realists believe is about the goals. What the states want. What are the goals of those states, of all the states? Well, there are two things realists emphasize. One is the national interest, the other one is power. So for realists, all states, without exception, seek their national interest and seek power. Meaning they're self-interested, they're self-seeking. They want to pursue and promote what they want, what's good for them. They don't care about what others want. Or if they do, they try to override that. They try to challenge that. They see the world as a zero-sum game. That what is good for me is not good for... What is good for others is not good for me. What is good for you is not good for me, and vice versa. I win, you lose. You win, I lose. That kind of a mindset. There's no win-win here. That both sides, or all sides can win. So self-interested behavior means not regarding the interests of others and trying to have a foreign policy which simply gears towards your own interest. Now, to some extent, that's true. Every country tries to seek its own interest, promote its own interest. But for realism, that's the only way. There is very little scope for behavior that is trying to achieve a win-win situation. There's a states might say, governments might say, talk about cooperation, might talk about win-win. But in reality, all they're trying to do is to promote their self-interest. Now, the Chinese government of the day today, the new government of China, talks about win-win. That's in the foreign policy of China. But most countries, including the United States, doesn't believe that Chinese really want win-win. They're basically trying to promote China's own self-interest. It could be different in other situations, but that's what a realist thinks. And power, to increase your power. Power here is material power, economic wealth, and military power. Every country tries to build up its military and economic power. And power is relative, power versus others, power relative to other countries. You want to go ahead, get ahead of the others. That's the goal of every country. It's universal, it's timeless. It has been the case through history, and it is today the case with all the states. The fourth point follows very closely from there, and it's about war and peace. Realists don't believe that peace is really possible. Peace is an aberration, short term. What is more common, more regular in international relations is war. And war is almost inevitable because every country is self-interested. Every country is trying to seek its power over others. And there is no higher authority like the UN or God above you. So, war becomes inevitable. If there is no police force in the neighborhood, there will be fighting. If there is no government to maintain law and order, there will be fighting. If there is no penalty for bad behavior, there will be fighting. So, war becomes inevitable because every state is seeking self-interest or national interest, seeking power, and there is no higher authority above the state. For realists, war is recurring, timeless, inevitable. And that leads to the fifth point, which is about the role of international organizations. For realists, international organizations do not matter. They are there, but they don't really matter much. United Nations is there, European Union is there, ASEAN is there, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all these are there. But they don't really matter very much. They're only as good as the states want them to be. They're very limited. They cannot prevent conflict. They cannot prevent war. Most of the time, they're weak and ineffective. So what matters, however, the only thing that matters is what is called self-help and balance of power. Balance of power is a way that everybody for himself or herself here, but you can have alliances and you can balance the other side. You can have a military build-up, you can have economic growth, and you can balance the power of the other side. Now, how this works is, like if you are China, for example, China is rising. The way to deal with China is not through ASEAN or the UN, but build up your own military and then have an alliance. If you're too weak to have your own military power or economic power, you have an alliance. So you join up with 2 or 3 other states and gang up against China. So, for example, the way the United States is behaving towards China today. United States is concerned, afraid a little bit about the rise of China. So the United States main response is to have more military deployments in Southeast Asia, East Asia. It's called rebalancing or pivot. That's the official policy of the US towards East Asia. So rebalancing or pivot. And has to move its forces from Europe and the Middle East to Asia. So that's the kind of basketball term. Pivoting or rebalancing. And that's purely a military thing, but sometimes also economic thing. But the United States is also strengthening its alliances. Its alliance with Japan, alliance with South Korea, alliance with Australia, and a little bit also its informal alliance with Singapore and its formal alliance with the Philippines. So the United States is pursuing a balance of power strategy, even though it tries to also deal with China through the UN or through ASEAN. For a realist, the main policy of the United States is a balance of power policy. It's a self-help policy. For countries like Philippines, countries like Singapore, which are small countries, or weak countries, relatively speaking, or Japan, economically powerful or militarily weak, what they do about China? Well, they can also build their military. Japan is building its military, so it's called self-help. Singapore is doing the same thing, building its military. Philippines doesn't have much resources to build its military. But for all these states, none of them can individually match China. But through an alliance with the United States, they can. So they are building up alliances. Some of them, actually each of them had alliances already, and now they're strengthening it, reviving it, so that they can jointly challenge Chinese power. So for realism, that's the name of the game. That's the nature of international politics. It's not through ASEAN, not through United Nations. These are all simple talk shops, insignificant. The real game is the self-help and balance of power. That's how states behave towards each other. So pretty much like, going back to the metaphor of the new neighbor, when you are afraid of a new neighbor arriving in your neighborhood. You are very careful, very cautious. China is newly arriving power as a great power and newly emerging as a great power. And you are fearful, mistrustful, you try to be careful, and you try to put up your defenses. Now, liberalism, moving from realism to liberalism, many of the same assumptions are in the reverse. And liberalism is more optimistic, and it has different views on each of these categories. So, what about actors? For liberalism, state is an actor, but it's not the only main actor. There are other actors in international relations, other players in international relations. And those players could be international organizations like the UN or European Union or ASEAN and the like. There are multinational companies, big corporations have a lot of influence, and they matter. They can make a big difference between conflict and cooperation, war and peace. Also, non-governmental organizations, groups like Amnesty International or Greenpeace or Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Human Rights Watch, all these non-governmental organizations also matter. They play a very important role. So for liberalism, the range of players in international relations is broader. They're not just states, political or governments. There are all these other actors and players, which makes international relations more complex and also gives the possibility that you can have more bridges between nations. You can have more cooperation. Because multinational companies have a very general interest. They operate across different national boundaries. So they have to make not only one state happy, but several states happy. So American multinationals have to not only comply with the rules of the United States, but they also have to make Chinese government happy. So they are trying to find a bridge between America and China. Or non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross, for example. For Red Cross, the main purpose is humanitarian. They don't care whether the victims are American or Chinese or Pakistani or Afghani or Iranian. They have to provide help, rescue, and help to all the actors, all the people, all the states, all the societies. So they don't play by the rules that governments play by, and they create bridges between different states and different societies. So liberalism, therefore, has a very more complex and in that sense more positive, non-exclusive view of international relations. And that leads to the second point about liberalism, which is anarchy. Yes, there is no higher authority above the state. Yes, we don't have a super state, we don't have a super god. But we do have all these other actors, international organizations, European Union, ASEAN, non-governmental organizations like Red Cross, or multinationals like Google or IBM. You cannot ignore them. They're not police. They're not an international police force. But they do make a difference. They do provide some structure, some sort of a way of compromise and mutual cooperation, mutual understanding among states and societies. They try to build bridges. So therefore, they create common norms, common principles, and common understanding in international relations. So the anarchy, the effect of anarchy is mitigated. Anarchy is an objective condition. There is no higher authority above the state. But that doesn't mean states are going to fight with each other. Because these other actors provide a structure, a connection, a kind of a network of cooperation and understanding, which mitigates the effects of anarchy and help states to understand each other better and cooperate with each other. So anarchy is not an absolute condition. It's moderated, it's managed. You cannot simply go and break the rules of the United Nations. You cannot simply break the rules of ASEAN without incurring a penalty. You can say that I'm going to break the rules of the United Nations and attack another country, but there isn't going to be a penalty. You are going to be counterattacked. There will be sanctions against you. You break the rules of ASEAN. Well, ASEAN is not the United Nations or the European Union, but there will be some reputational cost. You will be seen as a bad guy, bad actor. And sometimes you can be, under some circumstances, you can be also asked to leave a regional organization like the European Union or in the future, maybe even ASEAN. So breaking international law has consequences. Therefore, international law system is not as anarchic as people think. And the next point about liberalism, it follows very clearly from the second point, is that states also seek harmony of interest. It's not about national interest. What is yours, what is mine, how much you win, how much I win. But it's also win-win. Win-win situations are possible. It is possible to reconcile your own self-interest with the interest of others. And there are mechanisms that allow you to do that, like trade. Free trade allows you to do that. International institutions allow to do that, or organizations allow to do that. It's possible to have a harmony of interest, a common ground between your interest and my interest. And the next point follows again from the previous one, war on peace. Liberals are more optimistic about peace than realists. They don't think war is inevitable. And they particularly think this win-win outcome, mitigating anarchy and avoiding war, can be achieved through three things: economic interdependence, trade, investment, financial cooperation, production, common production or production networks. It's also possible through international organizations like the UN, like the WTO, like the IMF, World Bank, ASEAN, and the European Union. And it's also possible to have it through democracy. And this is a particular belief of the liberals, that democracies are more peaceful towards each other and democracies do not fight with each other. So more democracy in the international system, the better. So it's called the democratic peace theory. And it's a very liberal argument. Not many people believe, realists don't believe that, but liberals certainly think the reason why America is at peace with Canada, or America and Western Europe, European Union is so much at peace, because they're all democracies. But America and China are not at peace. They mistrust each other because China is not a democracy. That's the liberal argument. But it's not the only mechanism for peace. It goes with economic interdependence and international organizations. Final liberal point is about international organizations. Since this also relates to realism, I think one has to bring this out. Liberals are very strong on the role of international organizations. Very, very committed to the role of international organizations in creating peace and providing what they call collective security. Collective security is a system whereby attack or aggression against any member country of the UN will be punished by all the other member countries of the UN together. It's not the system where a country is left to self-help, to defend for itself. The United Nations has a role in protecting each country against aggression. So a country is attacked by another country, the United Nations has a moral and legal obligation, not just moral, legal obligation to help the victim against the aggression. Just like what the UN did when Iraq attacked Kuwait in 1990. The UN authorized a force. That force went to Kuwait and fought with Iraqis and threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait and liberated Kuwait. Now, this is an extreme scenario. In real life, it's very difficult to have that kind of a neat, clean operation like the Iraq-Kuwait case, but that's the theory. And also, luckily, we don't have too many interstate conflicts, too many situations in one country attacks another country directly and openly anymore. So that role of the United Nations is not very much tasted anymore. But what is tasted is UN's role in peacekeeping, in dispute settlement, conflict resolution, and the like. So if the UN or organizations that are linked to the UN settle dispute, the International Court of Justice, for example, can settle disputes through arbitration, like territorial dispute between Malaysia and Singapore or Malaysia and Indonesia, have been settled by the the International Court of Justice. The United Nations provide peacekeeping, where there is a conflict and there's an agreement. It sends forces, the blue helmets, they go and separate the factions from re-engaging, fighting with each other again. So the United Nations does a lot of that. European Union promotes economic integration and therefore provides for peace. ASEAN provides ideas and norms and principles for cooperation among Southeast Asian countries. For liberals, these institutions, organizations are very important. The global or regional, they're very important, and they are not just marginal. They are of consequence. Okay, so that's the realism and liberalism. Am I run out of time? Or I have 10 minutes more? When do you finish? 11? You feel 11:15. 10:50. So we have run out of time. I see it's 11 o'clock now. So I will try to give you I'm coming back tomorrow. I'll try to finish up the third theory, constructivism, tomorrow. Okay? Thank you very much. And you can also ask me questions. I'm looking at that watch. Yes. We are past time. So thank you for listening. See you tomorrow. So after talking about realism and liberalism, let me now talk about constructivism, the third main theory of international relations. Now, just a little background to this theory. Liberalism, realism, they are the sort of older, much older theories of international relations. Constructivism is very new. And realism, some people say, goes back to the Greek city-states and, 2,500 years BC, years ago, and during the time of Greece and Rome, the war between Athens and Sparta. Some people trace realism way back to that period. Liberalism is more new relative to realism, and some people, and usually scholars think of this as a sort of a modern political theory after the medieval period in Europe, from the Renaissance, Reformation, but even the Enlightenment, more like the 18th century, 19th century, particularly a 19th century philosophy, and since then it has become much more popular in the 20th century. The idea particularly that you can achieve peace through free trade, international organization, and democracy is only about 200 years old, 200 odd years old, going back to the 19th century onwards. But constructivism can only be traced to the post-Cold War period. There wasn't much talk about constructivism, at least in the writings of international relations, in the name constructivism, before the end of the Cold War. There was a little bit of that before, when people talk about international society, ideas and norms and values in international relations. But really, it was after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union that people thought about constructivism. Constructivism emerged as a distinctive theory of international relations. And even then, nobody thinks of it in the same way as the realism and liberalism. But what is distinctive about constructivism is again, we can use this 5 categories, 5 points of comparison between constructivism and the other 2 theories. But just keep 3 things in mind, and I've highlighted them in this PowerPoint. One is about international norms. The second one is about socialization, and the third is about identity or collective identity. So constructivism is a theory that focuses on norms or ideas or principles of conduct, talks about socialization in the way people socialize among each other in a society. States socialize among each other in the international system. And also the idea of a collective identity. It talks about identity. What's your sense of who you are and how you're different from others, and how to reconcile your identity with my identity and build a collective identity, whether it's a national identity or a regional or an international identity. Those are the key words of constructivism: norms, socialization, and identity. And one of the key points of constructivism, which is very different from realism and liberalism, that constructivism says that international relations is driven not just by power or wealth, or military power or economic wealth, but also about ideas and norms, about values. So values, ideas, and norms matter. These are ideational, these are not material, unlike military power or economic wealth. But your ideas and norms and values do have a major impact on international relations. The ideas, norms, and values of states or policymakers, leaders, or people, societies, they are all very important. For constructivism, that's much more important than what realism and liberalism give them to be. For realism and liberalism, ideas and values and norms are not central. I mean, especially for realism, they are inconsequential. For liberalism, ideas and norms may matter, values may matter, but they have to be sort of liberal values. And also, they're not fundamental. What is fundamental is still your self-interest, but you can find a common ground between self-interest and common interest, and therefore you can achieve peace. But for constructivism, achieving peace is impossible without a convergence of values and norms and ideas. It cannot be achieved simply by a convergence of your self-interest, your interests. So the importance of ideas, norms, values, subjective factors. These are subjective factors, not objective factors. That's central to constructivism, and that's what separates constructivism from other theories. So in terms of the first sort of point of comparison, actors, constructivism is a little bit like liberalism. It's and very different from realism. So for constructivism, it's not just states that are the actors, or main actors, or only actors in international relations. You also have international organizations, non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, transnational movements like campaigns for peace or disarmament or environment. All these are very important, like Greenpeace, for example. They're important. But constructivism adds one more category, which liberalism somehow doesn't talk about all that much, and this is the idea of either individual or collective norm advocates, people who are into propagation, advocacy of norms, advocacy groups, basically. You find them a lot in the civil society, in the non-governmental organizations. And for constructivism, the role of these groups is very important. So, for example, the role of human rights advocates, human rights groups. Somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi would be very important to constructivism. It may not be very important to realism or liberalism because she's not a state actor and she was not a member of parliament until recently, but a political prisoner. But for them, for constructivism, that's the kind of people also make a big difference. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India, very important. He was not the president of India, he was not prime minister of India, but very important. Martin Luther King of the United States, very important. And even if you're not into peace and democracy, but you are into specific areas, like campaign against apartheid in South Africa. When South Africa was under white minority rule, people who campaigned, people like Nelson Mandela, who later became president and just passed away, sadly, recently. But people like him, when he was not president, but he was an important player because of his ideas and his norms and his values, and also his way of mobilizing people, not only his own people, but also people around the world. Similarly, people who advocate disarmament, people who advocate peace, people who want to ban chemical weapons, landmines, nuclear weapons, people who want to promote environmental protection. All these groups are very important actors in international relations because they champion certain values, certain norms, which are progressive and which, if realized, could lead to a big difference in the way the world operates. So that's one distinctive contribution of constructivism. It's not something realists recognize. Liberals do to some extent, but constructivism really puts a premium. The connection between these transnational advocates or advocacy groups, especially norm advocates, and the norms themselves, a very important factor in international relations. And that became very clear after the Cold War ended, when we had kind of a relatively optimistic mood in the world. There was end of apartheid, end of the Cold War, collapse of communism, a lot of talk about promotion of human rights and democracy. And that's when constructivism took off and created a sort of new way of looking at international relations. It's not just, during the Cold War, it was about American versus the Soviet Union, between American military versus the Soviet military, between American democracy and Soviet communism. It was very kind of mechanistical. There was no common ground. After the end of the Cold War, we find that this American and Russian or military power or economic wealth is only one part of the game, one part of how the world works or why the world works the way it does. What is also important is the values, ideas, norms, whether they're for peace, disarmament, cooperation, and the like. And that's when constructivism became very important. And in that sense, for constructivism, actors are the broadest. There are a lot of different groups that contribute to international relations. And that includes states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and norm advocates. And norm advocates can be individual norm advocates like Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, or it could be groups like Human Rights Watch or Greenpeace and the like. The second point about constructivism, point of comparison, is about the structure. And constructivism believes that anarchy, like similar to liberalism, but much more so, that anarchy can be managed. Anarchy is not a given, it's not permanent, it's not a fixed aspect of international relations. Now remember, realists think anarchy is objective, permanent, fixed. You cannot change it. There's no higher authority above the state. Liberals say that you can mitigate anarchy through free trade, international institutions, democracy. But liberals also take it for granted. They don't say that you can have a super state or you can abolish, overcome anarchy. But a constructivist will go a step further and say you can actually overcome anarchy. Why? Because anarchy is not a given. It's not a permanent feature. It was created by states. The states, at a certain point of history, decided they want to be sovereign, independent. They want to have pursue their national interest. But then, if they try to change their mindset, we can have common norms and values, institutions to promote those values and norms. You can actually overcome anarchy. You can actually prove that anarchy is a social construct. It's a human construct. Anarchy is what states make of it. It's not a permanent feature of international relations. So a little more optimistic than liberalism, and much more so than realism here. And moving on to the third point of comparison is the goals. What do the states want? Or what do the actors of international relations want? And for constructivists, international organizations and NGOs, particularly those, and also states to some extent, but particularly international organizations and NGOs, have a common stake in peace and community. They really try to promote peace and community since they are also actors and not the state only. Their goals also matter, and their goals are to create a community and community of nations and a peaceful community of nations. So there is not that states pursue their self-interest or try to simply find a common ground between their self-interest and the self-interest of others. Because international relations has a multitude of actors, particularly very important actors in non-state organizations and non-governmental organizations, non-advocates, international organizations, and because states also believe in values and norms, it is possible to go much further, and you can really think of a common stake, a common interest, a collective interest. So it's not just win-win, how much you win, how much I win, but it's also sort of a common goal, a common standard of happiness and peace for entire international community, international system of states. And that means, going to the fourth point of comparison, war and peace. Constructivists are much more hopeful about the world, about peace, about community. And they do not accept for a moment that war is inevitable. They would say that a lot of periods in history there has never been any war, and because anarchy is not a given, because states can go beyond common national interest, and try to find kind of a common point of happiness and prosperity and peace. And because of that, you can really achieve lasting peace, not short-term peace, but lasting peace, durable peace. And for constructivism, one particular term that is very important here is the idea of building a collective identity and building a security community. Now, a collective identity is a sense of togetherness, a we feeling, not I, you, but we. When states develop a we feeling, that's what a collective identity actually means. Our collective identity is, that's when a collective identity is realized. So, and by the way, this can happen within states and between states. I mean, in some states, like here, there are different ethnic groups, and sometimes they compete, sometimes they fight. But when you get all of them to say, we are part of one country, you develop a we feeling among different groups, that's when you become a security community at the national level. At the international level, the same thing can happen. You have different states, they all have their different interests, different territories, but when they, through interaction, through norms, develop a common identity, a togetherness, we feeling, then you become, you achieve a collective identity. For constructivism, that's possible. For realism, that's impossible. For liberalism, may be possible up to a point, but not really. For constructivism, that's possible. And to give you two examples, in Europe, in Western Europe, we have the European Union. Now, the people of the European Union identify themselves both as the individual, in terms of the individual countries like British, French, German, but they also call themselves European. So the European label is a collective identity. The French, British, and German is a national identity. Now, for constructivism, the European identity has become as strong, if not stronger, as the national identity. Most people in the European Union identify themselves as Europeans. And they are also helped by the fact that there is a European Commission, there is a European Parliament, there is a European passport, there is a European, what they call external action service. It's like a foreign ministry and and European diplomatic corps. So Europe, that part of Europe has developed a collective identity. In ASEAN, we also sometimes talk about an ASEAN identity, not as strongly as the European Union or European identity, but people here are increasingly, especially in the urban elite, urban areas, among the politically informed groups, they see themselves not only as Singaporeans, Malaysians, or Myanmaris, or Filipinos, but they also see themselves as part of an ASEAN community. They see themselves as Southeast Asian. And it's not very strong yet, and there are a lot of problems and divisions among ASEAN countries, but still it's unmistakably there. When you talk about the discourse of the foreign ministries, the foreign policy interactions of ASEAN countries, when ASEAN countries meet with the United States, when ASEAN countries together meet with the European Union, they're actually called the ASEANs. There is an ASEAN anthem now. Of course, there is this ASEAN Secretariat, not as big as the European Union Secretariat by any means, but there is an ASEAN Secretary General. So Southeast Asian countries are developing, and not yet developed fully, but are developing or are attempting a collective identity, a sense of we feeling. Now, when you develop that, that is a collective identity, and you also become what is called a security community. A security community is a term in international relations theory that means a group of states which have ruled out the use of force in their mutual relations. A group of states that have developed expectations, long-term expectations of peaceful behavior, which means that they may or may not remain independent. There are some security communities which merge together to create a federation. By the way, the United States started not as the United States of America, but started as a number of colonies. But then they merged into the United States of America. So different independent colonies became, technically they're all part of the British Crown, but they operated separately from each other before the War of Independence and the creation of the United States of America. The United States of America became a security community out of previously independent units, and war among those states, between Massachusetts or Virginia, but no longer possible. The North or the South, the Civil War, of course, divided the United States in the mid-19th century, but that also ended, and then today the United States of America is a security community at the national level. The European Union is trying to become like that. Some people, at least in the European Union, believe there should be a United States of Europe. Now, United States of Europe would mean that the national existence of France, Britain, Germany would be replaced by a United States of Europe. And that idea is still very controversial. Not everybody believes in it, but there is a constituency who believes in a federation of Europe, a federal country, a federal state of at least the European Union member states. And that's security community at the national level. But at the international level, it's very different. Here, states do not give up their sovereignty. They still maintain their sovereignty. But they still develop a we feeling. And as part of that, they no longer foresee, they no longer expect to fight with each other militarily. They may still have independent territories or sovereign, they may still have sovereignty, they may have some conflicts, but they resolve their conflicts peacefully without going to war. And you can say with confidence that that's what the European Union today is. It's not the United States of Europe, but no European Union member expects to fight militarily another European Union member. There are conflicts between, say, for example, recently there was a kind of outbreak of tensions between Britain and France, Britain and Spain, Great Britain and France and Spain over Gibraltar. And there were actually some deployments of British Navy there to Gibraltar. Because Britain claims the island of Gibraltar, which then Spain also, Britain actually owns technically Gibraltar, but Spain claims it. And they were into tensions and even military deployments recently. So it's not like European Union has ruled out conflicts. But they do not expect to fight to resolve that conflict. They do not expect to go to war with each other. The members of the European Union do not expect to go to war with each other to resolve their problems. Now think of Britain and France, or France and Germany, particularly France and Germany. How many wars have they fought with each other through history, before the Second World War and including the Second World War? They fought in a number of wars. They are historical enemies, France and Germany, or France and Britain, or Britain and Germany. But today nobody expects Britain and Germany, Britain and France, or France and Germany, or France and Britain, any kind of dyadic pair there, to fight a war with each other. France and Britain do not expect to fight. France and Germany do not expect to fight each other, no matter what the dispute is. But look at that between Japan and China. Japan and China are not in the same situation. They're also like a little bit like the two big players of Asia, like France and Germany, but they have not ruled out the use of force. In fact, they're very much in dispute and very close to some kind of a conflict, military conflict, over the East China Sea island dispute. So a security community is what we see in the Western Europe, kind of a soft, pluralistic, what do we call a pluralistic security community? A security community where the nation states are still sovereign but do not expect to fight each other and resolve their conflicts peacefully. And in Asia, we don't see that between Japan and China, because they very much expect to fight with each other over any kind of dispute, particularly the serious dispute like the East China Sea Islands. What about ASEAN? Now, in case of ASEAN, it's not like the European Union, but it's also not like China and Japan. It's somewhere in between. In fact, you can say that ASEAN was created in 1967, and there are 5 member countries at that time: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines. And there has been no war among those 5 countries since 1967. So at least those 5 countries have not fought, the original members of ASEAN have not fought a war with each other since 1967. So at least they are a security community. Even though there have been tensions between Malaysia and Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia over territorial issues, and there has been nationalism on both sides, but there has been no real war. With the new members like Cambodia and Myanmar and Laos, Vietnam, there has been conflict. Especially since 1967, there was border conflict between Thailand and Laos. There was a big war between Vietnam and Cambodia. Vietnam occupied Cambodia for a decade. And of course, there were tensions between Thailand and Cambodia, Thailand and Myanmar. So if you make ASEAN as a group of 10, it's not a security community. But you think of ASEAN as the original 5, it is a security community. And ASEAN is, even today, despite the tensions we have today between, Cambodia and Thailand, there is a border conflict over a Buddhist temple there. Even if you look at that, it's not like China and Japan. It's not like if there's a conflict, it's going to be so large scale that it's going to be very destructive for the whole region. So ASEAN countries have norms and values and kind of a development of a we feeling. And that we feeling allows them to step back from war, not to fight each other despite having problems and differences. It's very different from China and Japan, have no we feeling. China and Japan always see each other, at least in the current context, see each other as enemies, as rivals. And they expect that there will be conflict. They don't want to have conflict, but they do not rule out conflict. So for constructivists, when you can have a situation like the European Union today, or the situation among the ASEAN 5, original members of ASEAN, or ASEAN generally, today, not in the past, but ASEAN in the post-Cold War period, when you have that situation, you are talking about a security community. That is a we feeling. That's a collective identity. And that is possible in international relations. That kind of can happen. And it's not like it's very, it may not be very common, but it's not totally absent either. Why is this important? Because it's very different from the way the realists look at it. It's not wearing the dark glass. It's wearing the blue pair of glasses. When you see the world in very different terms. And it's also different from liberalism, because liberals are always trying to think about gain, mutual benefit. The liberals are not giving up their self-interest. They simply think that it's possible to find a common ground between your self-interest and the self-interest of the other side. But they're not becoming totally part of a community or a we feeling. When they do become part of a community, they develop we feeling, that becomes constructivist. It sort of spills over into the constructivist domain. But for liberalism, self-interested behavior is still very important, just that it can be reconciled with the interested behavior of others. But for constructivists, it's possible to transcend that, look and go above and beyond this interest calculations or the rivalry. It's possible to achieve a situation where you can actually be a security community and have a collective identity. So it's much more of a optimistic way of looking at international relations. So if you look at realism, liberalism, and constructivism, realism is the least optimistic, and liberalism is more optimistic, and constructivism is most optimistic. And that's how we differentiate in a crude way between those three theories. And in that sense, this is the fifth point of comparison among the theories, and it's about international organizations. International organizations matter. They matter a great deal, because to develop a collective identity, develop a security community, you need an organization. So there will be no security community of Europe or Western Europe without the European Union. I don't think, for a constructivist, Germany, France, Britain, Spain, all these countries could not have achieved a we feeling or a security community without the European community or the European Union. Similarly, ASEAN countries could not achieve kind of a early stages of a security community, a sort of nascent security community, a kind of a preliminary version of the security community without ASEAN. So institutions have to create norms, socialize member states, provides a sense of togetherness, provide a venue of interaction, and that's how they bring together countries. Now, in Northeast Asia, we don't have that kind of regional organization like ASEAN. There is no real ASEAN organization between binding China, Japan, and South Korea, North Korea, not to mention Taiwan, because Taiwan is not recognized by China as a state. But even between the four sovereign states of Northeast Asia, China, Japan, North Korea, and South Korea, there is no ASEAN kind of organization. And for constructivism, that may be one reason why they haven't developed that kind of peaceful behavior towards each other. And it can be sort of chicken and egg. The reason why they don't have a regional organization is because of rivalry, and the reason why they have rivalry is because they don't have a regional organization like ASEAN. But whatever it is, for constructivism, institutions, organizations, international or regional, are very important. Even for the UN doesn't create a global security community. We have so many conflicts still in the world, say between Russia and the US, or Iran and Saudi Arabia. We still have a lot of conflicts, India and Pakistan. We still have conflicts, North and South Korea. There are conflicts that have not disappeared. But the United Nations does contribute to interactions and peaceful behavior. It does create a sense of togetherness. If you go to the United Nations, you go to the Security Council and General Assembly, you can feel that it's not a complete case of everyone for himself or herself. It's not a jungle out there. There are some expectations of peaceful behavior. The United Nations creates an expectation that everybody must behave peacefully. The United Nations doesn't do that simply by the force of a threat of force or sanctions, but through socialization, through bringing all these countries together under sort of one roof, so to speak. So for constructivism, being members of the United Nations, it may not create a collective identity like that of the European Union, but it does create something of a sense of togetherness. And that's a subjective feeling, but that's still very important for international order, international peace. And for that matter, for constructivism, the impact, the effect of international organizations is simply not to provide a regulatory mechanism, meaning there are rules and there are laws and there are habits and you cannot break them. If you do that, we'll penalize you. That's a regulation. When somebody regulates your behavior, it tells you these are the rules, you have to abide by them. If you don't, you're going to be penalized. That's how states work, governments work, and in some cases, that's what the United Nations does. The United Nations was created to provide mainly collective security. Collective security is a way of telling everybody who is a member of the United Nations, behave peacefully, do not commit aggression, do not attack another sovereign country. If you do that, you will be penalized. And the penalty is that the rest of the members of the United Nations will organize themselves and counterattack and throw you out of the territory that you have occupied. There was actually a sanction. There was actually a threat of force. Make no mistake, the United Nations Security Council is authorized to use force to punish an aggressor state. That's recognized under international law. If you have signed onto the UN Charter, you are part of that law. You have to abide by it, and any country, technically speaking, can be punished if it commits aggression. The fact that in reality countries get away with this doesn't mean the law doesn't exist. And in some cases, countries like Iraq in 1990-91 have been punished. And having that threat of punishment does deter countries from attacking each other. It's always in the calculation. If you want to take over the territory of your neighbor, what the UN might do to you. It's not something people simply ignore. No matter how much of a dictator you are, no matter how aggressive your intentions may be, how powerful you may be, whether you are China or you are Iran, or no matter how big, powerful, or how small you are, you always think of that penalty that UN has in mind. UN can inflict on you if you have signed under the United Nations Collective Security Agreement. And that's what the United Nations is about. There are many other things the UN does, like development and refugees and health. But the key rationale for United Nations was and is collective security. One for all for one, in terms of punishing and discouraging aggression. But for constructivism, United Nations is much more than that. It doesn't rely simply on the regulatory framework. It also changes your identity. It changes the way you look at yourself. So by being a member of the United Nations, and especially over a period of time, 20, 30, 40 years, you internalize this idea of peaceful change, peaceful behavior. And it's not like you are always making a calculation to attack and pulling back because of the threat of sanction. That's a regulation. What you are doing after 30, 40 years of being a member of the United Nations is that you believe in this. You actually identify, you internalize those values. You become a different actor. You are no longer the self-seeking, self-interested actor or state, always thinking of your own interest, always thinking of your own power, but you are thinking also of general, how to maintain peace, how to maintain stability, how to achieve prosperity. So it's not like states always think in terms of power, interest, conflict, rivalry. States also think in terms of peace, togetherness, and shared prosperity, shared destiny on a regular basis. It's not like we wake up every morning thinking of how am I going to fight my neighbor, how I'm going to impoverish my neighbor, how I'm going to get ahead in the game. You also do that by thinking in terms of, you also wake up in the morning thinking of how I'm going to have good relations with my neighbor, how I'm going to contribute to peace and stability. And that becomes normal and natural. It's not just utilitarian. It's not just a calculation you make because of your own interest. You become part of a group. And when you become part of a group like that, and you develop this group mind, the collective mind, then that's what international organizations really aim to provide. And that's what they end up providing over a period of time. So if you look at this, then it's like if you have a new person coming to your neighborhood, the new neighbor metaphor. If you're a realist, you are distrustful, suspicious, you put up your defenses, you put up a security alarm around your house. If you are a liberal, you look at your neighbor, you don't make any judgments, but you mainly think what you can get out of the new neighbor, what he or she has to offer to you, and you can be nice, but you always get something in return. Very calculating, very utilitarian. If you're a constructivist, you would think that you're a positive feeling. There's a newcomer. Well, it's great to have a newcomer. We will welcome that person. We will help him to settle down and create a stable, peaceful neighborhood. And you internalize it. You don't always making that calculation, or you're not acting out of fear either. So the neighborhood, our new neighbor in a new, or a person in a new neighborhood metaphor does explain the three theories of realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And together, they are the three main theories of international relations. Just to remind you that there are mixed outcomes. These theories can actually exist together. It's always the case that one country is more realist than liberal, more liberal than constructivist, or one policymaker, one leader one person has one of these theories in greater degree than the others. So, and it can also vary from time to time. Some countries are more realist at one point of history, more liberal at other points of history. People expect that China is very realist today, but some people really expect that it becomes liberal or even constructivist 20 years, 30 years down the road. So let's socialize China. If you look at the rise of China as a central problem for the international community and for Southeast Asia, look at China as an emerging power, like a new neighbor. So you look at it with fear, suspicion, you build up your weapons, and you form alliances against China. You have rebalancing pivot, all these policies that the United States may be pursuing today, is pursuing today. Or you can look at China as not a threat, but as an opportunity, something you can get out of China through close interaction and through trade, through also membership in shared institutions. For example, China was not a member of the WTO. It has now become a member of the WTO. China was not part of any Asian regional grouping until the 1990s. Now it's a member of ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asian Summit, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. It's a member, dialogue partner of ASEAN. So you can be like, through institutions, interdependence, you can actually get China to do things that are good for you. But you can also look at China as a constructivist, as a new neighbor. You socialize China into new ideas and new norms, like the principles of ASEAN. So one of the things that China has done, and through the persuasion of ASEAN, is to sign on to the ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. It's called TAC, or TAC. That's a code of conduct. It's like a set of guidelines of how countries in the region should behave and what they should do and they should not do. That's what norms are about. Norms tell you what's right and what's wrong. They prescribe and prescribe behavior. So China has signed on to this, and China becomes therefore socialized. You're socializing China through new norms and ideas. And you're socializing China to norms that are new to China, but are already part of ASEAN's own institutional and group set of framework. So for constructivism, that's the way we should deal with China. Welcome China as a new power, hope that it will rise peacefully, but try to socialize, not build alliances, not simply expect something in return and be very calculative about it, but try to give China a platform, a place under the Asia-Pacific sun, so to speak of. And that's basically how you can also, that's the third way you can create a new neighbor. And that's constructivism. So realism, liberalism, constructivism, in that sense, kind of gives you three different ways of looking at international relations, three different ways of looking at the rise of China, and three different ways in which everyone, all the states, all the policymakers, leaders, people, analysts, view the world. Not only what the world is, but how the world operates. Not only to understand the world, but explain what's going on, explain what the events and affairs of the world, also make some projections and predictions and anticipations about the future, and also prescribe policies, how they should, in the international community, should behave towards other states. So this is where I stop, and